Hi everyone, welcome back. Happy New Year. I hope you've all had a great break, a nice and well-earned rest. It's obviously been quite a crazy year, and I mean, it looks like 2021 is shaping up to be just as crazy. Well, I mean, no, let's not say bad things we don't want to happen. Sorry. Anyway, let me start again. Hi, Happy New Year. Today we're going to be doing a little bit of thinking about some of the stuff that you have, some of the exercises that you've kind of worked on a little bit over the Christmas break. Really just pushing your thinking as well about space and investigating that, which is why we're calling today's reflective practice session investigative practice. So as I kind of touched upon last year, if you harken back to one of the first sessions that we had, I talked a little bit about how architecture and design is almost it's almost always of its time. It kind of represents the spirit of the time, whether that is the social context, the political context, or the economic context. These conditions are kind of like almost always a big part of what makes a space a space. And this goes not just in terms of space, but I think we'll focus on space for today. So over the course of last term as well, I've tried to kind of deliver this to you in different fragments. So we looked at how gendered societal expectations in the 20th century led to the kind of the design of the modern kitchen, how time and routine can affect landscapes intentionally and unintentionally, how tradition and sort of time-honored culture has kind of continued to preserve but also define architecture in the context of West Africa with the mosque that we looked at. So really continuing on from that, I really want us to do a little bit more of thinking in a way to think a little bit more, to push the idea of this kind of social / cultural / even political idea. So I'll be giving you a couple of examples as we go along through in the lecture today. We're going to be putting on our best investigative hats, and we're going to do our best to see and try to understand the stories that are hidden in plain sight. Sometimes this is literal, but what I want you to approach today's discussions with is not just the idea of what is in the space, but why and how it is in that space. So hopefully this is what the examples I'll give to you will set up. So in the first context, I'm going to look at streetscape with a particular focus. I'm going to talk about anti-homeless architecture. Some of you may already know what this is. Some of you will remember, or the idea of the term anti-homeless architecture will conjure up images of these kind of spikes. The whole thing with anti-homeless architecture is a very long and kind of deep, it's complicated topic, but for those of you who don't understand or don't know what anti-homeless architecture is essentially design intentionally made to make it difficult for homeless people to basically find shelter. The more you think about it, the more you realize that you don't have to go to too many layers of questioning to understand that the social and political context behind it is about like hiding the undesirables, let's say in very big quotes here, members of society. So sometimes traditionally it was something as pervasive and as obvious as spikes on the ground. Nowadays it's taken on this kind of slightly more undulating and sexy form. You've got these beautiful benches, which are actually not too far away from where I live. I didn't take this picture, but I recognize this bench. Now these benches are designed really to make it very difficult for anyone to lie across them, sleep across them, as kind of a homeless person might do. And they also are kind of designed to make it difficult for you to sit down comfortably for a very long time as well. So it's about kind of like the design decisions behind this are very intentional in making it very difficult for people to either sort of hang around or loiter for too long, but also to actually just sleep as well. But this doesn't necessarily just get applied to benches, and going beyond anti-homeless architecture as well, thinking about the high street. It's also worth thinking about, and I think some of you will probably have picked a couple of high streets, is thinking about the kind of shops that they are. When you look at high street, why are those shops there? Because most of the time, shops don't just pop up for no reason. They tend to have a community that they target or that they aim to serve. With most supermarkets, even within supermarkets, some supermarkets will more likely to be appearing in other areas. So for example, Waitrose is less likely to be in a kind of a slightly less well-off area than in a well-off area. And a much more obvious example is kind of like these betting shops. Now this article is from 2013, but it makes a very good point about the fact that in East London, there's a road called High Street North, I think it's called. It's like a 2-mile, 3-mile long stretch of main road that goes through East London, which has 18 betting shops. And it basically is really shows you these kind of some of the tactics and some of the reasons why these betting shops will kind of go for slightly less well-off areas with slightly more working class people. It's because there's an intentional understanding of how they can exploit those people to be able to make more money. So again, you don't have to go to too many layers, but just asking the question of why this shop here will lead you to understand some of the wider things, some of the frameworks, some of the intentions and motivations that are at play. So the next scale I want to look at is the city scale. So the cityscape as a general, like the urban landscape, as some people might call it, different words for the same thing. So really what I want to talk about is how, for this bit, is how you can layer information to try and understand more about something. So the example I'm looking at here is from a publication called The Pattern. And it is a publication put together by some architects and urbanists in America. And it basically sets out to try and understand prison incarceration systems and try to spatialize that within the context of a few American cities. And essentially what they do is they take a few American cities and they overlay different bits of information that are relevant to the point that they're trying to make. And they try to find patterns, which is kind of what the name is coming from. And within this process, they also identify these blocks, so areas of housing that are defined as $1 million blocks. Now, the idea of the $1 million block comes from this this understanding, or it's kind of this math that they're working on, was essentially the amount of money that the U.S. government or the federal government spends incarcerating, so putting people through the prison system, the penal system, per block. And so in areas where there's a lot of people being sent to prison, they would have an incredibly high, essentially block value, as it were, an average block cost. And so through using these kind of different metrics, they looked at percent of people of color on the left. They looked at people on the below the poverty line on the right. As you can see, you can start to see a general concentration along these areas. And then as going forward, they also looked at percentage of adults admitted to prisons and then the prison expenditure by block group. So it doesn't always directly correlate, but there is clearly a link here in the way that these are linked out. And the idea is that as they kind of added these bits of information and added layers of analysis, they started to find points which are very obvious. So this is zooming in on a completely different scale. This is at a block scale now. So as you can see, in red, this is the block that's in question. Now, this is not necessarily, this is not $1 million block by the maths. You can tell it's definitely not. That's 300,000, that's not $1 million. But the point is that compared to the area around it, this block is far, far more. There's a lot more people going to prison, or at least the expenditure of the state on sending these people to prison is much higher than anywhere else within the immediate vicinity. So this is a good point to look at because it presents an extreme case. So you can start to learn a little bit more from the extreme cases. So what they did then is they then pulled their kind of analysis hat. They took off their, the data analysis hat onto, and then they put on their kind of spatial analysis hat. So they looked at the urban fabric, they looked at the area immediately around this block to try and understand what is the context of this. So again, looking at the social context and the spatial context is just as well as important as understanding the data. And so they found these kind of characteristics. So for example, this contaminated groundwater immediately to the east of the site. There's vacant commercial, so it's essentially the fabric of the area, the urban fabric of the area. So basically the type of buildings, the state that the buildings are in was not good at all. This is clear. This is an area that has a lot of empty houses, a lot of empty commercial units, contaminated groundwater, and former industrial estates, old industrial estates, and an elevated highway. These are all things that are not conducive to a good kind of social environment because they're very alienating. They're not nice places to be. And so within this, they started to analyze these layers. And then, I mean, the conclusion is quite obvious, but the methodology itself is really interesting. And so again, it's about asking why and how rather than just describing what. So that's one of the main important things I really want to hammer in today. And I think one of the best examples of people who do this really effectively is a practice called forensic architecture. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of them. Forensic architecture essentially are a kind of a human rights activist group slash research group. I think they essentially call themselves a research group, but they operate on the fringe of architecture, sort of spatial 3D design, analysis, research, human rights group. They're essentially operating in human rights. So what they do is they investigate things that they call are invisible. So through their lens of kind of their architectural spatial analysis, they build these models or these interesting ways of looking at and reconsidering human rights violations, war crimes, some really heavy stuff, and they essentially try to serve justice through that. So again, they're trying to investigate these injustices and try to understand as much as they can with their spatial thinking about how these things have kind of been addressed or how they haven't been addressed. And so yeah, they describe themselves as architects, journalists, scientists, and graphic designers, and so many more. So they're truly interdisciplinary. And I think the best thing to do is to just show you an example, a very short clip of what they kind of one of the things that they've done. I think is really interesting. So hopefully this will work.
City streets become a battleground in many wars, and the buildings turn into targets for bombings. And even though innocent people die, often the official statements explain that the bombs were only dropped on enemy terrorists. Helping to uncover the lies of wars is forensic architecture. Through the process of architectonic recreation, the agency finds evidence of abuse in war zones.
Hi, Mr. Weisman.
Its creator is the Israeli architect Eyal Weizman, who had the idea of examining the streets and buildings as if they were dead bodies.
Think of us like pathologists of a building. You know, sometimes a doctor pathologist would look at a human body and would say, that scratch came from a knife, that came from poison or bullet, etc. Buildings are like mediums of inscription.
How do you proceed with your inquiries?
Imagine a bomb falls in Syria. The minute that happens, hundreds of people would switch on their smartphone and will record that incident from multiple perspectives. In order to tell a story about what happened, you need to sequence those images in time and space. You need to know which one was the first to film, from which direction, etc. And to do that, we have developed a technique called the architectural image complex. That is to say, we build architectural models, so sometimes urban models. Sometimes we'd build the entire city in 3D, and we'd locate all the perspectives in it. And then you can switch each one at a time and follow the story of what has taken place.
In March, the US Army announced that one of its drones killed a group of terrorists in a bombing on an Al-Qaeda facility. However, the forensic architecture team proved that the building was, in fact, a mosque, and that dozens of civilians were killed.
We found the actual architect of the building. There were plans, there were photographs, there were all videos during construction of what this place was. We have constructed first a blueprint and then a model. We matched then all the photographs from inside the model so that we can see absolutely precisely that what was targeted was indeed a mosque and that the Americans were lying.
Some people refuse social networks because the lack of privacy and surveillance, and you do the opposite, using these sources to play surveillance on governments.
Yeah. So that's the principle of counter-forensics. That we repurpose all the tools, all the bad tools of states. No, they spy at us from everywhere. We would take those techniques and repurpose.
Okay. Yeah. So let's just move on. I will share this video, the rest of the video, with Sally. So if you're interested, I think she'll share that on with you. Essentially, they don't just do cases abroad. They also do cases in the UK. One of the cases that I was like initially really caught my attention was they investigated the shooting of Mark Duggan by the London Met back in 2011, which actually was what started the 2011 riots across London, but also spreading across the rest of the UK. And in this, they basically use, again, spatial analysis, try to understand the mechanics of how the situation went down using witness testimony to understand, or to at least try to question the narrative that the police put forward in their report, which was not exactly reliable based on some of the evidence and some of the findings that they had, which they openly like showed their process. Anyway, so and then they also more recently looked at Grenfell, and this is still an ongoing project where they're documenting different videos and different aspects, different things collected by people on the night, just videos of Grenfell and things like that, to be able to build a timeline, and rather than try to investigate, because the investigation has kind of been has already kind of shed light on a lot of the things that went wrong. It's also a way to try and understand and document the process of what happened over the course of that night and make sense of it. So to kind of try and wrap this up, again, the question for me that I want you to all think about is just like not just the what, but also the how and the why things happen, or the kind of buildings or spaces are designed the way that they are. So thinking about this is going into your questions. But before we do that, I also want to highlight that though this last example is extremely political, I'm not necessarily saying that you need to be very political or deeply political in the angle that you take. It's something that will come naturally, because almost everything that has to do with space or design is inherently political in some way or form. It's just to the extent at which it comes through. So really just thinking about the context of what these questions or what the questions that you're going to be asking about your space are is really important. So my question for you today, and it's only one question, keeping it light, what is the story of your site? And when I say that, I mean, what is the thing that makes, for example, when you look at whether that is the example of high streets, why are there so many pawn shops? Why are there so many like betting shops? And what is the story behind that? Like, why does that serve the community? So asking why and how when it comes to your when it comes to your site or the area that you're examining is really kind of key in this week's kind of questions, but also leading on to what you're going to hopefully move on to doing in the next week. So I hope that was interesting to all of you, and I hope that that kind of gives you some food for thought. And yeah, let's have a good discussion about it. All right. Thanks for tuning in, and I will see you soon.